Hi guys, this is a little late, but at the end of last year, the end of 2025, I had an idea that I thought would be really fun as a way to do the drawbacks of doing this outside in the country. So you always hear a chainsaw or two. Cool. So I had an idea that I thought would be a really fun way to do the end of 2025 reading wrap up. It's just to play off the Spotify Wrapped. You know, in the Spotify Wrapped every year, they have different fun categories. So I thought that would be a fun way of talking about my reading for 2025. Unfortunately, we are a month into 2026 already. So I'd like to petition that January is kind of like a scratch. You know, no one's quite ready for the new year yet. So this year, we're starting the new year on February 1st. So I have, let me see, I believe 10 categories. The first one is very, very brief because I already talked about my stats in my last video, but this will be my overall year in books. I just wanted to correct some of my earlier stats from one of the earlier videos. So I did end up reading 57 books last year. Of those 57, I rated 55, and my average rating was a 3.4 star, so it was pretty low. I feel like that kind of fits with how I felt my reading year went. There weren't a lot of very, very low lows, but I feel like a lot of the books I read were very middling. For me, a 3-star is, you know, a fine book, a book that I'm not upset I read, but I probably won't think about again. And I do feel like I read a lot of 3-star books this past year. The next category is a classic Spotify category of hours or minutes listened, and I translated this into pages read. In 2025, I read 17,203 pages, and that's an average of about 301 pages per book. I don't tend to read super chunky books, and I did read a fair amount of short stories, novellas, and poetry collections this year. My next category is top artists. And I wanted to do something a little different with this, and I want to do my new favorite artists. This year I found a lot of booktubers that I had never heard of before that I really enjoyed the type of content they put out, and I watched all of their videos, and I wanted to give those people a shout out because I don't have a lot of people who follow me on here, but if anyone hasn't watched their videos before, I highly, highly recommend. And even though some of these are big booktubers, I don't know, the algorithm shows everyone different things, and so maybe you haven't heard of some of these people, and maybe you have, but I just wanted to give them some love, and these are my favorite artists or favorite booktubers that I found this year. So I really enjoy watching all of these people for different reasons. I've been really into Erin Megan's TBR Slasher series. I love watching people's Rita Ora Hallett style series, but the way that Erin does it is so fun because she treats it like a slasher. So she has to find out which of her books are her final girls. She uses the spinner wheel, and then depending on what she reads, she chooses one or multiple final girls that are not getting slashed from her TBR. It's me, Mikkel. I really enjoy seeing her love of Frederick Bachman because he is my favorite author. And I also appreciate that she usually recommends romance that aren't smutty. I don't love reading smut. I just find it kind of boring and cringy. And so I appreciate that she has a lot of recommendations that are smut-free. Jen's Bookshelf is a self-published author, and she vlogs all the time. She does a weekend vlog every week, and then I think she does weekly vlogs every week, but I'm not 100% sure. But right now my favorite content from her is she's doing like these brainstorm style videos where she'll just brainstorm the stories she's writing and the books she's writing and tell you about the characters she's building, and it's so fascinating and inspiring seeing someone else work through their creative process, and knowing that she has several published books out is really inspiring. So I've been loving watching her this year. I've mentioned Jo's Journey before. She is also an author and a reader. She's reading all of Clarice Lispector's books in publication order, and so I've loved watching her talk about all of the Clarice Lispector books she's read this year because I read my first Clarice Lispector this year and absolutely adored it. So she inspires me to keep reading Clarice Lispector. McKenna loves content, just creates really high quality, fun videos. I loved watching her reading all of the Hunger Games for the first time and then also reading all the Twilight books for the first time. Those were both really fun. And she also has some of the most unfiltered opinions on books, and I find it really fun to watch. Mel Reads is a very popular booktuber, so I'm sure most people already know her, but I really love her themed vlogs, and she also is just a very, I feel like, authentic person, and I have really enjoyed watching her this year. And finally, Pretentious Sunshine is just such a relatable person. All of her videos are funny. I think she has a great sense of humor. Yeah, and she's just very relatable. I feel like half of her content is just her being like, yo, I don't know what the fuck I'm doing, but here, come read with me. And I feel that on a spiritual level these days. So that was my new favorite artists of 2025. The next category I have is another classic Spotify category, and that's top genre. So my top genre this year is just literary fiction. I read a lot of literary fiction, and especially the authors that I read multiple books from this year, such as Elena Ferranti and Clarice Lispector, definitely skewed it in that direction for me. I also read some Frederick Bachman, Ottessa Moshfegh, and Melinda Lowe. I'd say my next highest genre is fantasy. Things like Babel technically are fantasy, but I don't really know how to categorize it. I did read the Shepherd King duology, which I will get to later. I read my first Brandon Sanderson. I read some cozy fantasy. I finished the Fallen God trilogy by Hannah Kaner, and I read the newest in the Wayward Children series. I'd say my third highest genre was horror. I'd say the biggest culprit of my horror reading this year was Miss Rachel Harrison. I read 3 Rachel Harrison books. I also read C.J. Tudor this year and Grady Hendrix. Besides those main 3 categories, I had a sprinkling from, I'd say, almost everything else. I read some cozy mystery with Richard Osman, some poetry collections with Mary Oliver and Franny Choi. I read some contemporary romance with Tara DeWitt and Lila Sage, as well as 2 nonfiction books. Again, in my other video, I thought I didn't read any nonfiction, but I did read the book about Père Lachaise, The Cemetery, and 50 Words for Snow. So those were my most read genres of 2025. Now I have my most skipped songs, which would be my biggest disappointments of 2025. These books that I'm about to talk about, they are neither my most lowly rated books of the year, nor are they all bad books at all. They were just books that I had certain expectations for that weren't met. So first on my most disappointing list is Strange Beasts by Susan J. Morris. Again, I actually had a fun time reading this book, but I was just disappointed. I was expecting gothic horror, sapphic yearning, Sherlock Holmes vibes, and I was left with something that I thought was kind of a disappointing mystery, lacking chemistry, and just not as interesting as I thought it would be. And I've heard it really, really hyped up, so that is one of my most disappointing books. My next is Tress of the Emerald Sea. Tress of the Emerald Sea was my first Brandon Sanderson that I've ever read. I've heard that it's a really excellent place to start with if you love Brandon Sanderson, and I've also heard that if you love stuff like The Princess Bride, you'll love this book. I gave this book 3 stars. I adore The Princess Bride, but I wasn't as enamored with this world as I wanted to be. On a very similar vein, Sword Heart was one of my most disappointing reads because I've heard such amazing things about T. Kingfisher, and I thought that if anyone could make me root for a romance, it would be her. And I just didn't care that much about the romance in this book. I really only cared about Brindle. He was the thing that kept me picking up this book, but I was disappointed with Sword Heart by T. Kingfisher. And finally, this is not a genre that I generally have high hopes for, but everyone was so obsessed with the series that I could not help but be disappointed, and that was the Shepherd King duology. I read both One Dark Window and, Two Twisted Crowns, Two Twisted Fates, hold on one second. Something is being twisted. Two Twisted Crowns. And the first one I had a fun, good time with. It wasn't, again, something that I was enthralled with or super intrigued by. But the second book, my God, did I hate that book. That book made me want to yell at the main characters because they were pissing me off so badly. So my final most disappointing reads of 2025 were the Shepherd King duology by Rachel Gillig. Okay, I'm back, and I've ruined the illusion that I'm wearing proper pants. Okay, my next category is my reading age. So this year, Spotify had a listening age category. I was, I believe, 74. My reading age was younger than that. So this is my reading age for 2025. So I have two different reading ages. I took the year of publication of all of my books and gave them each, depending on how long ago they were published, an age. So if they were published in 2025, they were 1. If they were published in 1925, they were 100, etc. And my reading age, based on my sloppy math there, was about 11. But my emotional reading age, I would say, is somewhere in my mid-40s. I would place myself firmly in middle adulthood. I read a lot of books about people just trying to figure themselves out, but they didn't feel young. For example, the Neapolitan series, those characters were young. We were following them from the ages of about 5 or 6 to like their early 20s. Well, technically until they were much older, but most of the series took place before they were 25. But the feeling of the series was much older than that. In addition to that, I read a lot about elderly people because I did read 2 Richard Osman books this year. And My Friends was a mix of the very young coming of age and the older looking back on their life and trying to figure out if they are content with their life, make amends with mistakes they've made, stuff like that. So I felt like going somewhere right in the middle, an age where maybe you expect to have everything figured out, but you certainly don't. So I decided that my emotional reading age was somewhere in my mid-40s. I also feel like I just read a lot of like mom books this year. So my next category is my reading town. And again, I have 2 different ways of doing this. I have the scientific way, which is from all of the books that I read that were set in a real place. I took the midpoint of all of those books. Most of the books that I read took place in the UK, Southern Europe, or the US. There were, of course, some outliers. Clarice Lispector is from Brazil. Fredrik Backman is from Sweden. I read several books in translation from Japanese or Korean. But the average midpoint appeared to be somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. So I can't really give you a reading town for that. But yeah, somewhere triangulated between like Italy, the UK, and the east coast of the US. That is my like physical reading town. But again, my emotional reading town, between the gothic vibes of Daphne du Maurier and the Nordic origins of Fredrik Backman, the sun-soaked summers evoked by Clarice Lispector and Elena Ferranti, the foresty northeast that is present in a lot of Rachel Harrison's books, and the pure natural wonder that Mary Oliver talks about, I feel like my reading town would be a small town in a foggy coastal European city. Maybe it would be the north of Spain, in the Basque country on the coast, somewhere like San Sebastian, where it has these beautiful, bright summers, but especially in the fall and winter can be very cold and gloomy and rains a lot, but with that Southern European summer and flair and food and hospitality and warmth that comes with that. And it would be a slow-moving town where you can get out to nature easily, where you're expected to linger in bookshops and cafes, and it just doesn't move too fast. A lot of the books that I read, and my favorite books, were very internal and slow-moving, and I think that would be reflected in my reading town. Next category I have is if my reading was a playlist or a daylist. I have to have a little bit of an ominous vibe in there from the horror that I read this year. I have to give a nod to the fantasy and magic that I read this year, but at the very base of my reading, I believe it was very introspective and a little melancholy and emotionally gripping and very existential. And I would go with my creepy existential spellcasting Monday morning. Next, I wanted to do my reading aura. A few years ago, Spotify gave us our listening aura and gave us a color that There's some birds battling it out. Anyway, I wanted to find the average color of the covers of books that I read this year. Of course, when I actually tried to figure it out, it turned out to be like a dark kind of gray, which is not very interesting. So instead, I put all of the covers into Canva, and then I used the tool that showed the main colors from each photo. I feel like my covers were predominantly cool toned this year with pops of specifically bright pink. So picking out my top 5 colors in I'd say my 2025 reading color palette, let's call it that, I would go with a very, very dark blue, a more like navy blue, true blue, a foresty green, a lighter kind of seafoam blue, green, teal color, and then a pop of pink. So that's going to be my color palette. It's going to be a very deep, dark, midnight purpley blue, a more true blue, a darker forest green, a kind of seafoam blue, green, misty color, and then a pop of pink. So that's my reading aura or my reading color palette of 2025. My last category before I get to my top books of 2025 is my reading decibels. So I will call that the emotional volumes of my reading this year. For books that gave me the strongest emotional reactions, I'll start with the books that made me the angriest this year. So the books that made me angriest, because that's what the author intended, was for me to feel frustration and anger at injustice, were Babel by R.F. Kuang and Witchcraft for Wayward Girls by Grady Hendrix. These are both books that deal with incredible amounts of power imbalance, which is very frustrating to read about, and you feel kind of a righteous anger along with the characters in the books. Now, the book that just made me the angriest and want to yell at characters the most was Two Twisted Crowns by Rachel Gillig. I was so annoyed with the choices that the characters made that I was just constantly wanting to yell at the characters in this book and be like, just don't be so stupid. So those were the books that made me the angriest this year. The books that made me the most scared or creeped out were The Gathering by C.J. Tudor and The Return by Rachel Harrison. Both of these books have a sense of creeping discomfort where you feel like something is off, but you're not quite sure what. And they both also just have some like gross horror goriness to them. So those were the books that scared me the most this year. The books that made me cry the hardest this year were My Friends by Frederick Bachman and The Last Devil to Die by Richard Osman. So I wouldn't say that either of these are necessarily very sad books, but they do have heartbreaking moments that made me very, very sad and cry. And the book that made me laugh the hardest this year was The Impossible Fortune by Richard Osman. Okay, the sun is going down. You just fell off my porch, and I really want to finish this. So I apologize if the angle is different than it was about 30 seconds ago. And where was I? I just had to run downstairs off the porch into the grass, and now my socks are all wet, but I don't really have time to go change them before the sun goes down. So I'm doing this in wet socks, just for you. Oh yeah, I was talking about my emotional decibels. Right. And then I was talking about the book that made me laugh the hardest. So the book that made me laugh the hardest in 2025 was The Impossible Fortune by Richard Osman. My final category for this Spotify style reading wrapped of 2025 is the one, the only, my top books of the year. In my previous video, I made a bracket style battle to determine my favorite book of the year, but that didn't determine my top 5, or in this case, top 6 of the year. So I wanted to tell you my favorite books of 2025. Okay, hello again. We had all sorts of technical issues yesterday. The latest one being that my camera died and I didn't even realize. So I filmed the end of the video without my camera being on. But no worries, I will just finish it now. But yeah, yesterday I ended on the final category of my top reads of the year. So as I was saying, I'm gonna have a top 6 because I've already talked about my favorite book of the year. So I want to mention that here as well, obviously, but I also want to mention my 5 other top books of the year. Besides my top book, they are in no particular order, and that is Aqua Viva by Clarice Lispector. This book is such a delightful slice of introspection and examination of the themes that Clarice Lispector wanted to discuss in this book. It's really short, it's less than 100 pages, and it's written as a letter that the narrator is writing ostensibly to her former lover, but also perhaps to herself. And she just dives into the idea of communication and of time passing and of connection in such a raw, beautiful way that I filled the book with highlighting and underlining and writing little notes in the margin. It's probably my most annotated book from this year. But yeah, I'm just so in awe at her ability to put so much emotion and so much thought into such a short book and in such a unique format. The way that she uses words is so interesting. I was reading about Clarice Lispector as an author, and people say that she's almost harder to read if you're a native Portuguese speaker reading her book in Portuguese, because you expect the words to make sense in a certain way, and she always flips it on her head. Every word that she chooses has so many different meanings and layers, and it's just such a beautiful book. If you're going to read anything on this list, I recommend Aqua Viva. I think everyone can learn something from it, and it was just a beautiful reading experience. So that is my favorite book of the year, Aqua Viva by Clarice Lispector. And then the other 5 are in no particular order because I refuse to rank them, and you can't make me, and I won't. So the next on my list is Bel Canto by Ann Patchett. And this is such a masterclass in slow storytelling that doesn't get boring because it's building towards something at the end. I'll tell you what this is about. It is about a hostage situation in a South American country that all kind of revolves around this opera singer. Everyone came to this party to see this opera singer, and then in the middle of the party, a rebel group breaks in and takes everyone there hostage. And people say that this is based off the real life events that happened in, I believe, 1996 in Peru at the Japanese ambassador's house. Something similar happened. In this party, these rebels come and take everyone hostage, and what follows is weeks, if not months, of the rebels and the hostages having to commingle and live together, in the lines between them getting more and more blurry as they spend more time together, as they get to know each other, and the forced proximity makes them get to know each other. And it just follows the monotonous nature of their lives in this house, trying to come up with solutions and being kind of more and more removed from the outside world. But you know that they're in this bubble of comfort in the routine of this new life they have, but you also know that it can't end well, at least not for everybody. There are such quiet moments of peace and understanding for these characters, but it's impossible to ignore that there has to be a conclusion to the story. I think what she does amazingly is makes you question your circumstance and your privilege and think about who would you be and what different choices you would have to make if you weren't born where you were born and raised by who you were raised by. The way that this book makes you question your own beliefs is really beautiful, and I loved this book. I described it before as like a snowball rolling down a hill where it starts slow but it picks up speed, and by the time it hits the bottom, you know it's going to cause devastation. You can kind of just feel that build up throughout the whole book. That was Bel Canto by Ann Patchett. The next book I have on this list is a poetry collection by Franny Choi, and it's called The World Keeps Ending and the World Goes On. This is a poetry collection about history and the future and like an impending apocalypse and what's going to happen if humans don't take care of each other and take care of the planet. And it was published in 2022 and really focuses on the years between 2020 and 2022 and kind of how the world was falling apart in that like crazy time of liminal space between being completely isolated and so many people coming together to fight for something that was really important during the Black Lives Matter protests. A feeling of safety and peace for everyone when no one was feeling safety or peace. And it also touches on like the climate disasters that were happening and the massive fires throughout the US. And it was just a very touching, very poignant poetry collection that I recommend everyone reads. So that is The World Keeps Ending and the World Goes On by Franny Choi. The next book on this list, I'm the last person probably in the world to put this on my favorite books list, but it is Babel by R.F. Kuang. I'm sure you've heard about this book. It's a dark academia looking at colonialism and translation and the power imbalance there and who benefits from this practice of stealing the intellect of other countries. And it talks a lot about the space in between translations, between words, and how you can never exactly translate a word, even if it means on the surface the exact same thing. There's all of this historical context and cultural significance of certain words and their meaning and their etymology and their history, and you can't capture that when you translate. And that's where the magic in this world lives. It's definitely actually Babel, but it's so hard for me to get out of the habit of saying Babel. So I'll probably fluctuate, but I'll try to say Babel. It took me so long to read it because I was intimidated. I was afraid that I wouldn't understand and that it would be too much for me. But if that's what's holding you back, I recommend just starting it, because it's so much more engaging and easy to understand than I thought it would be, which was really holding me back. So don't let that hold you back. This is the time if you want to pick up Babel by R.F. Kuang. The next of my top reads of the year is The Last Devil to Die by Richard Osman. This is the fourth in the Thursday Murder Club series, and I think it's tied as my favorite between this one and The Man Who Died Twice, which is the second installment. It is the book I think that made me feel the most range of emotions, from literally laughing out loud and making me so happy and so hopeful for these characters to being absolutely devastated. Obviously, I can't tell you much about this particular installment because it's the fourth in the series, but the Thursday Murder Club series is about a group of retirees living in a retirement home, and they come together to solve cold cases and kind of stumble into a life of solving real crimes. So that was The Last Devil to Die by Richard Osman. And my final top book of the year is Such Sharp Teeth by Rachel Harrison. This is a campy horror story about werewolves, and it really focuses on trauma and how you choose to express or embrace what's inside of you. And I love Rachel Harrison's relationships that she builds, not just romantic, but also the platonic, especially the female friendships that she builds. Something else I love about Rachel Harrison is that she is really good at building these characters that have flaws and that are selfish and want to look after themselves without making that an indication of them being a bad person, because sometimes you have to be selfish. You have to take care of yourself first. And especially as women, we're expected to be caretakers for other people. And what Rachel Harrison does is she makes these women caretakers for themselves first. And they have to struggle with that feeling of selfishness that comes along with, this bird is having a time. Anyway, they have to struggle with that feeling of, am I being selfish or am I putting on my own life vest first? And women aren't expected to do that. We're supposed to help everyone else first. And if you don't want to do that, that's fine too. It's not your job to make other people comfortable. Obviously, that's to a certain extent. If you're going to interact with society, you need to be respectful of those that you're interacting with, regardless of who they love or how they identify or where they're from. But in terms of taking on the emotional energy to make someone else feel safe and cared for, you have to do that for yourself first. And in all of Rachel Harrison's books that I've read, her characters have to choose themselves over other people sometimes. And I really appreciate that theme in her books. And that's the end of my 2025 reading wrapped. So thanks so much for watching and ignoring the fact that it is now February 1st or 2nd or whenever I'm posting this. You know, in my culture, our New Year starts in September. So in that case, I'm either very late or very early. And that's also a reminder that if you are beating yourself up for not having stuck to goals that you made for the new year, or if you haven't even had time to make those goals for yourself, or if you don't want to, that's fine. January is an arbitrary time to do that. The middle of winter is for slowing down and for hibernation. And if you want to wait until spring to decide to make any self-improvements, which you don't need, but if you want to, you can do that at any time. You don't have to do it January 1st. And if you didn't do it January 1st, it doesn't mean you have to wait till January 1st of next year. It's just a little reminder because I also need to be reminded of that. So I'd love to know if you have a reading town or a reading age or what your reading aura was this year or anything at all, your top books of the year, anything you want to tell me, I'd love to know. So thanks for watching and I'll see you next time.